I'd like to also comment a bit on the sort of political dynamics we saw at the conference in Japan because it was my first time at the conference and it was quite extraordinary, I think, to see um, sort of the confluence of so many, international peace organizations and organizations of different nations come together to discuss this issue and witness the testimony of the Hibakusha. So, as we were saying, yeah, Jeremy and I were delegates to this 80th World Conference organized by Gensukyo, and I was honored to be invited there as a guest and a US delegate as part of my work with the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. And there is special importance to this 80th anniversary, this 80th commemoration, marking 8 decades since the attacks, and a profound grappling with a world where many seem to not have internalized the horrors of the bombing, given the passage of time, despite maybe logically and on the surface knowing about the horrors. And it was also a special year because it followed the recent Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Nihon Hidankyo in 2024. So this was a big moment and a very important meeting of parties. Um, and I think, what became clear, I think to me and many others at the World Conference is that, the tone is one of increasing urgency, I think, due to several factors. For one, we were present to witness the testimony of the Hibakusha to learn and spread the message that human beings and nuclear weapons cannot coexist. And we were struck by, maybe as we'll speak about a little later, the, aging and declining population of Hibakusha who are sharing these stories and sharing the testimony. Simultaneously, there was quite an air of seriousness due to the fact that we're entering a period of renewed militarization, conflict, and nuclear posturing that present strong challenges for the peace movement. So at the World Conference, there were delegates from 15 nations convened to share their situations and learn from others. Um, and one of the clear threads running through everyone's analysis was that, there's sort of a present danger of US driven military policy that's escalating the nuclear threat. Just to name a few sort of examples of this that came up in many delegates' speeches and writings. The US is really pursuing its plans to counter its perceived threats by nations like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Part of this is involving expanding and strengthening NATO, whose European member nations were recently commanded by, the new second Trump administration to increase their contributions to the organization to 5% national GDP, which some nations are going forward with and others are rejecting. The US alliances with nations in the Pacific region, like Japan and the Republic of Korea, are continuing and escalating. For example, in July, the US and Japan discussed scenarios where the US would use nuclear weapons in the event of conflict in East Asia, and the US and Republic of Korea are continually staging their annual large-scale military exercises. Other alliances like AUKUS and the Quad are somewhat continuing uh, their influence, although it's maybe subject to a bit of turmoil and shakeup with the new Trump administration, and we're unsure if those will continue. But there's been also an increase in conflict. Notably, in June, the US bombed Iran's nuclear sites after Israel launched attacks at Iran, presumably after nuclear negotiations did not go in the US's favor. And now, as of yesterday, I think Iran seems poised to withdraw from the NPT as the E3 countries, France, Germany, and UK, have moved to trigger the snapback mechanism on the sanctions against Iran, which is a dangerous escalation, I think we all recognize. And as Jeremy mentioned, the US and other Western nations are committed to modernizing their nuclear weapons, which is projected to cost, at least in the US, almost 1.7 trillion, almost $2 trillion over 30 years. And the US is now, for the first time, I think, since 2008, has returned nuclear weapons to the United Kingdom at the Lakenheath Air Base. And over the summer, not to belabor the point, but India and Pakistan had a skirmish, two nuclear-powered states. Israeli pundits and ministers floated the idea of using nuclear weapons in Gaza. So suffice to say, conflicts and militarization have been increasing, and this was one major theme at the conference. Everyone was very concerned about this type of thing. But at the same time, we're also struck to sort of speak to the hope and the messages of resistance and organizing. I think we're all very struck by while perhaps the global North countries and the Western countries are increasing their militarization, global South countries, by and large, are leading the non-proliferation movement, and they're leading movements for common security rather than this rhetoric of deterrence theory, as Carlos was saying, which is sort of a illogical theory that's bound to fail eventually. So the conference saw delegates from Cuba, Egypt, Marshall Islands, Mexico, Philippines, Vietnam, and other international organizations like the UN and International Peace Bureau. And representatives from these nations shared their successes, specifically in the widespread adoption, as we've heard, of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. The TPNW, as Carlos had mentioned, has been signed by over 90 countries and ratified by 73. And we really uplifted the success of this treaty as its initial vote at the UN was passed by 122 nations in favor. The only states that did not vote or voted no were nuclear weapons states and NATO members. So there's a clear split, right? And the global South is leading um, this more sane push for diplomacy and common security. So it was a huge sign of hope for the conference. Um, I also wanted to note as well that one of the other trends that we started noticing was that for global North countries and Western countries, there is quite a degree of similarity in political tactics and circumstances in nuclear states between US, European countries, and also Japan as well, which was striking for me and a lesson to be learned for me. Each of the nations are sort of fighting to stave off growing authoritarian regimes, taking power by using shockingly similar tactics of hollowing out social programs, increasing inequality, tapping into resentments and dissatisfaction, and then blaming, quality of life issues on immigrants or leftists or what have you. And in the US, I can say, speaking particularly, we see an acute escalation of these tactics by the second Trump administration while we're witnessing mass deportations and kidnappings by immigrations police, sort of a paramilitary war on enemies of the far right, and dismantling of social programs and government institutions. And this playbook seems to have been adopted in lighter versions by other nations, particularly across Europe. And I heard from some new friends and colleagues in Japan that also the right is sort of gaining power in Japan and using a similar anti-immigrant rhetoric and tactic to sort of spur their rise. So, sort of speaking again to the, Trump administration pushing NATO spending increases, there's worry about cutting social programs, as Jeremy mentioned, and other programs that actually benefit human life to pay for these increased militarizations. And this presents, yeah, a significant challenge to the global peace movement. And it would create less capacity to fight issues like nuclear disarmament and the pressing issues of the day. But I think also in the same vein, we saw it as quite a huge opportunity for the peace movement to locate a widely resonating issue on the fact that these far-right regimes are militarizing at the expense of life-giving programs and institutions, sucking money and resources out of our communities to fund their projects of death. And I suppose I'll finish by just saying two more signs of hope that I think really struck me. Um, and one was sort of seeing obviously the testimony and hearing the testimony of the Hibakusha who have led, a multi-decade campaign, nearly 100 years campaign to spread their stories and push for nuclear disarmament. Sort of witnessing that and really internalizing the strength and resilience and courage that it takes to continue organizing for so long and to keep uplifting these stories, I think invigorated the whole conference and gave a renewed sense of determination and hope to everyone who attended. Um, and also, I'll say that also, as Jeremy mentioned, there was a lot of common desire and will around the fight to acknowledge and stop the genocide in Gaza, which served as a confluence point and a framework of understanding the intertwining forces of colonialism and the military-industrial international sort of order. There were so many young uh, organizers, women, non-binary, and queer organizers that were all, incredibly concerned with the Gaza issue. There were Japanese Gaza protests at the same time as the commemorations. And I think that more and more we're seeing that young people across the nations are increasingly interested in a world of peace, a world without war, and there's incredible opportunity to seize on this moment and to spread this type of, anti-nuclear reasoning and these messages to young people, and they're ready to adopt them and fold them into their organizing, their advocacy, and their sort of common sense understanding of the world. Um, so I'll close by saying the potential to build the power to enact this movement that's really being led by the global South is there, that we just need to seize upon it.